sorry. Right. Sorry, that's not worked the way it was expected to that time. Right, okay, thank you for having me. And today I'm really going to continue this conversation, I guess, about the nature of working with AI and also working with Born Digital, and perhaps how that impacts upon the process that users go under to create the knowledge they're creating. And I want to talk specifically from a historical user perspective today in relation to organizational email. So this work relates to a project in relation to contextualizing email archives in the .com era. And it's a project I've been working on with a number of colleagues who I'll mention later in the session. So to unpack that user perspective briefly, as a user who wants to work with Born Digital material like email, and as a historical researcher, albeit one who works in a business school, you're faced with an environment where Born Digital sources are increasingly vital for historical research, particularly in those contemporary periods where we've moved towards a sort of post-analog past. And many Born Digital collections are going to be vital in understanding that part of our history and the history of organizations and businesses. But many of these collections remain dark or inaccessible. And I'm sure you're aware of the various reasons why this is. And in fact, this is a particular problem in relation to organizations. And one of the co-eyes on the project, David Kirsch, he's been involved for a number of years in how to protect and how to bring in some of these organizational collections from failed companies, but nonetheless they primarily remain dark to access for research purposes. Added to this, we also have a methodology which largely assumes the use of original pre-digital sources, and the ethical implications for using digital sources remain unclear for researchers, in as much as they also are an issue for archivists and archives themselves. So in that respect, we sort of want to take up this challenge of moving somewhat beyond preservation and thinking about what's going to happen in terms of actually using some of these Born Digital resources in terms of creating historical knowledge. And so Born Digital sources are, of course, shaking up traditional archival processes. We've seen that throughout many of the sessions that we've had today and throughout the other Aura sessions as well. And managing privacy at scale has remained a key barrier to making a lot of Born Digital collections accessible, particularly in relation to email. This is something that is quite common. And even though we have these problems, we still need to start thinking about how the user is going to become part of this process of access and accessibility. And in that respect, we need to think about how we can move towards a collaborative arrangement between both sides of the reading room in that respect. And in terms of users and what they want, you have a situation where archives do not necessarily understand the future or current needs of users. Users don't understand their own needs and what they will do with Born Digital material when they have access to it. And you have certain assumptions, certain wants, but not necessarily a lot of understanding, although there is a feeling that there is still the expectation of some curation, and also that there's going to be an increase in optionality, the ability to choose various ways of looking at data or sources in various ways and through various lenses, whether they be more statistical, more visual, or allow for close reading or more search-based reading. So what we've really been trying to do with this project over the past year or so is look at how we can actually start reading email, and particularly organizational email. And so that's really the question that we're going to deal with today is how will users actually engage with born digital material once access issues have been navigated. And specifically, we've taken up this sort of question in relation to how a historian, primarily we think about historians based in either business history or some form of historical research within a management context, because that's our own environment, but it's more broadly applicable than simply that. But nonetheless, how might a historian look at organizational email as part of their research process, and how might they actually go through that research process, and what do they need to do that? So just to say a little bit about the project in question. So this is a project that's been running now for a little over a year. It was extended because of the coronavirus pandemic, which has given us a little more time to look into some of the ideas around what we're trying to do in terms of creating some form of search tool for email that allows contextualization. So we're really interested in exploring the gap between the preservation in email and the means by which researchers can engage with them. And we're doing this with a particular interest in how users can contextualize what is a relatively often decontextualized object, where particularly when we see email on their own in isolation, or we start looking at email within a organizational context where you have multiple users and you have multiple different identities within that email corpus. So for the purposes of our research, we use the emails from a failed.com company, and we use these under the pseudonym Avocado IT. These were preserved and made available by the Linguistic Data Consortium. And so they are already available for research purposes, but we are the first to start looking at how this sort of information, this sort of data can be used for historical research purposes. Therefore, we come at this very much from the ground up. We're not dealing with a collection that has had the benefit of archival processing or support. It is more of a data dump in its nature, in the sense that it is data taken from hard drives, and albeit there has been some processing for sensitive information, it is primarily as it was when it was taken from the organization's servers. And so we have to treat it quite carefully, and we're not able to necessarily share as much of the actual data as we'd like to at this point in time. But it's very useful for the purposes of what we're doing in terms of trying to develop a prototype tool that allows us to understand how we might go about researching the .com era using this sort of organizational email, and also developing a more general history of that era as well. So just to provide an overview of some email specific issues that we have to deal with when thinking particularly about organizational email rather than the email of perhaps an individual. So we have something that is inherently networked in nature, and it's often difficult to search effectively unless that network nature is taken into account. So email both is and are, and also email contains a lot of information, as we've already heard today, that provides context in addition to information just about the content of those emails. And we've seen email be used a lot by non-historians, focusing on a specific part of this networked resource. So they might look, for instance, at frequency or networks. They could look at timing or sequencing between emails. They could look at the language used within emails, or indeed, in some respects, the content. But treating it more as more holistically in terms of contextualizing these data sets is something that is needed in order to work effectively with it as a historical source. And we need to take into account both the individual side of this resource and also the networked aspects of email in order to create something that can be worked with effectively for historical usage. We also made a few other assumptions as we started to develop our prototype sort of search tool around this particular data set. The first is we wanted to accommodate the need for increasingly diverse research questions. A lot of our colleagues who are interested in historical research are interested in historical research that also suits the social scientific methods that we see predominate within business and management research, and their questions differ from those of perhaps more traditional historical questions. So we wanted to take this into account. We also wanted to take into account that the user will want to work iteratively through the collection. They're not going to run a systematic, necessarily a one-time systematic query. They're going to want to return again and again and build upon their searches. We also needed to take into account that historians work tacitly and sometimes messily with the sources that they work with, and this is part of historical research, and it's something we bring with us from the norms of our practice as historians. And also, we wanted to provide for different levels of experience, from the casual person who is interested perhaps in the dot-com era to someone who wants to do more substantive work, perhaps using email as a primary part of their analysis rather than merely a point of triangulation. Finally, we wanted to work with a relatively complete organizational corpus rather than something that had been heavily redacted or only taking quite specific parts of that email, for instance, the CEO. So in the main, we took two approaches to contextualization, or considered two approaches. The first being the user-led approach, whereby a user has a flexible and quite substantial user search interface where they can have a lot of optionality about what it is they want to look for and where they want to look for it within that particular data set and when it occurred. These are the key recurring sort of contextual considerations we made. But those considerations very much are led by the user and led by the ability to take note of the structural characteristics of emails. So when emails were sent and received, who they were sent and received by, and so on. And this is going to revolve around fairly basic keyword searching, at least at first instance. So it's going to require fairly clear search querying. We're also at the same time looking at a more machine-led option, more reliant on algorithmic process and allowing for a more simple search, perhaps more of an opportunity for someone to come into the data set without a very specific idea of either what is in that data or indeed the nature of the historical case that they are interested in. And other details, contextual details around it. So this provides scope for new contextual discoveries that perhaps weren't available with the more user-led approach, but it does raise questions around source criticism, as we had so well described in the previous presentation. So just to give a bit of a summary of what a user-led contextualization process might be, the historian, the research user, comes in with their interest in perhaps e-business trends in the early millennium, so sees this data set as potentially interesting. They are going to make some structural selections based on some of the details within the email corpus, such as whether they want to look at internal email only or external email, whether they want to look at particular custodians, sent email versus received email, whether they are interested in whether someone is carbon copied or blind carbon copied, time, date, and so forth. They're also going to use key search terms and develop those quite specifically using your standard search logics. The more machine-led alternative that we considered, the user can come in with more of a general query. In this case, if it was to go through more standard keyword searching, that keyword searching would break it out and wouldn't necessarily provide very informative results. But through two models we developed, and when I say we, I mean our project partners at the National Archives who are involved in this side of the technical side of this. You have the first model, which does phrase matching, which provides you some level of further contextualization on a search term. And then model 2, which is attention-based content encoding that would allow you some more semantic linkages and to link you to other potential areas of interest. So this would provide you potentially a way to generate matched records, levels of statistical significance, and also some statistical analysis, as well as providing those links to new topics and new ways of referring to the e-business trends between 2001 and 2002. What we are working towards is the idea that using both a user-led and a machine-led approach to contextualization, a user can iterate between these two forms of searching within email archives, depending on their needs, depending at their stage within the research process and their specific question at any given time. And indeed, it may be that one form of contextualization and search will lead to interest in moving over to another form of search. For instance, it could be that you start with a fairly general search in relation to the topic. You find there's a particular person of interest, so you then develop a more specific search query around that person, and then perhaps a specific period and a specific topic. And that would be where the user themselves is starting to deal with the messy nature of email, well, the large and scaled nature of email, and the fact that they are dealing with multiple users throughout the organization. And eventually they may iterate back to a machine-led alternative. Another thing I wanted to quickly mention is the idea that we can bring context back in. So what we found very important in our understanding of this case, of this company, is that external sources of context are really important in informing our understanding of the email corpus. So one of the key external sources of context that informed our understanding of the data was the organizational chart that allowed us to structure out various user accounts throughout the organization. So we could create, for instance, a bracket for C-suite employees, a bracket for middle managers, and so on. We're also looking at how to incorporate known relationships. So for instance, the fact that a lot of the CEO relevant information doesn't go through the CEO, but instead goes through their PA. And we've also looked at how we can connect certain market and geographical events to the emails and potentially find a way of further contextualizing this information, and also triangulating with other organizational methods. And what we're looking at the moment is how we can perhaps create filters whereby you can filter not only on the structural aspects of email, but also these external sources of context as well. So just to finish off, and before we break for discussion, I wanted to sort of pick up this what comes next idea. So thinking about how historians will actually use Board Digital and also our own project and reflecting on that, I think one thing is key is that clearly there are going to be historical use implications for unfamiliar archival technologies, including artificial intelligence. We as users are not familiar with these, and they're still very emergent. I think that's a key issue to grapple with going forward. Also, how will these new practices and approaches be integrated into historical methods? I think that's still an ongoing question. And also from a practical perspective, could more beta access to collections, perhaps in a more messy form, but with suitable protection, facilitate the development of user experience and interfaces to understand the nature of historical research on these sources a little bit better? And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.